We are connected.
Okay, great. Hello, everyone again. This is 2022 International Open Seminar on Semiotics, a tribute to John Dewey on 5th anniversary of his passing. Thank you, Dr. Brian, very much. Unfortunately, I couldn't catch the beginning. I have to, revert on that earlier, but thank you so much for your comprehensive and insightful presentation on the contribution of the very particular, special, unique contributions of Augustine on the instituting the given sign. So today we have an intervener as well on Dr. Brian's presentation. He is the proper intervener in a way, as he has a doctoral thesis on the philosophical problem of the sign in St. Augustine in tandem with the issue of lying. Here today, we are grateful to having Dr. Remo Gramigna. Dr. Remo, I would like to have a very brief introduction on your background for the sake of audience. So allow me, please. Dr. Remo Gramigna is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Turin, currently, a Department of Philosophy and Education Sciences. He teaches semiotics in this department. He is part of the research team Facets led by Professor Massimo Leone. Professor Massimo Leone is also one of the names in contemporary semiotics. Dr. Remo's academic research to date has mainly focused on the history of semiotics, the semiotics of culture, and also mainly on the deception studies. Dr. Remo has obtained a PhD in semiotics and culture studies in Estonia, of course, in the University of Tartu, and he has also lectured there in the Department of Semiotics. As I mentioned, Dr. Remo is the right intervener for this presentation, given that he has studied in depth the case of St. Augustine contribution on sign institution. He has got many publications on this topic. Some of his recent publications include Augustine and the Study of Signs, Signification and Lying, Forms of the Mask, Imagining Others, Deception, Predictions, and the Disguised Intentions in Strategic Interactions. For this particular seminar, International Open Seminar on John Dewey, Dr. Remo is a member of the Scientific Council. So I'd like to really welcome Dr. Remo to take the floor with his presentation. Dr. Remo, the floor is yours.
Good evening, and thank you very much for reaching out, first of all, and thanks a lot for inviting me today. Let me say that it's a pleasure and an honor to be here. The more so on commenting on such a compelling subject and on such an outstanding presentation. So thanks a lot for organizing this for us. I'm not very familiar with the structure of your seminars, so I thought to contribute with a few comments and a few questions for you in order to facilitate the dialogue between yourself, myself, and the audience as well at home. So one of the keywords in your brilliant presentation is the history of semiotics, and you have very well laid out the place of Augustine in such an history. This is praiseworthy in and of itself, and I believe it should not be taken for granted. As you have pointed out, there have been some scholars that have very well underscored the role of Augustine and his Scientia Signorum in the proto-semiotic development, and Professor John Dewey is a case in point. John Dewey played a remarkable role in tracing this history within the field of semiotics, and I am very glad, let me tell you, to see that his legacy is continuing and flourishing today. If I may add some names to the lists of scholars that have worked diligently and systematically towards the development of contemporary semiotics, standing on the shoulders of giants, as you said in your talk. We may also include Tsvetan Todorov and his book, Theories of the Symbol. We could also add to this list Umberto Eco, who in his article entitled Proposals for the History of Semiotics regarded Augustine's theory of science as an explicit semiotic theory. And also Giovanni Manetti, Professor Giovanni Manetti, that you mentioned in a quote from the book of John Dealey. Giovanni Manetti wrote this text, which is called The Theory of Science in Classical Antiquity. Also, outside the domain of semiotics, it is certainly worth mentioning the pioneering works on this subject carried out by the philosopher Belford Darrell Jackson, as well as by the British historian Robert Marcus, who were, in my opinion, the first studies ex professo that were devoted to Augustine theory of science. Now, all these scholars were catalyzers, as it were, towards opening up this fascinating as well as complex subject. So I really thank you, Professor Kemple, for bringing forth this topic today. A few words about the novelty of Augustine's thought and Augustine theory of science. You have very well stressed the influence of Augustine in the history of philosophy and in the history of semiotics, and you have laid out the linchpins of his theory of science. Perhaps it would be important to stress that Augustine's novelty was perhaps not so much the division between natural science and given science, but to have included words, verba, in the genus of science per se. In the Latin world, this was unheard of, and thus the inclusion of verba in the species of signa, I believe, is pivotal. If we limit our horizons to the Latin authors, he was probably the first to acknowledge this point. The second remark is that Augustine used his theory of science not so much for its own sake, but as an application to the interpretation of the scriptures. Thus, I really liked the point you raised about the instrumental nature of science, namely the issue of science as being instrumental to cognition, which is a very remarkable point. Perhaps I would only add to this point that the application of a theory of science to the interpretation of the scripture is also an important aspect to keep in mind with respect to the instrumental nature of science. Now, a few words about the concepts that you have pointed out of teaching and learning. Since one of the mottos of your presentation has been learning, so the issue of whether we as humans learn at all by means of science. So let me tell you that I did learn a lot from your presentation, and I thank you for that. I particularly enjoyed the bridge you have made between probably the most well-known work of Augustine within semiotics, the Doctrina Christiana, and perhaps some of his less known works, such as on the teacher, the Magistro. Although the Dialectica was left out in the presentation, the inclusion, on the other hand, of the Magistro and the Musica adds up a lot of valuable insights to this discussion. I particularly appreciated that you have singled out a conceptual and theoretical distinction between teaching and learning, which is not so evident in Augustine's work, or at least it is not as clear as one wanted it to be, which, as you have so brilliantly showed, brings up some paradoxical or problematic conclusions, to say the least. In a way, it seems to me that you go beyond Augustine, not only showing some pitfalls and some shortcuts in his writings, namely the somewhat arbitrary division between the outer world of science and the inward world of truth and knowledge. But we also reach out for solutions, finding a way out from this quandary and indicating in the system later laid out by Poinsot a possible solution. And this is really something that I appreciate. Yet whether we do need a better metaphysics or whether the problem of learning is resolved altogether through the recourse to Poinsot semiotics remains still an open question. As far as I understand, we will have perhaps a sequel to this presentation, bringing up Aquinas and Poinsot on the table. So I look forward to listen to the future seminars as well. As for the difference between the concepts of teaching and learning that you so well pointed out, it is worth noting that in the opening of the Magistro, there is a question which is posed by Augustine, which introduces ex abrupto a reference to the nature of speech. Indeed, Augustine asks, what does it seem to you we wish to accomplish when we speak? And Adeodatus replies, either to teach or to learn, as two different functions of speech. However, things, as you have pointed out, get quite murky when teaching and learning are somewhat linked to the successful uses of science. And I have appreciated a lot that you made a sharp distinction between these two concepts, inasmuch as it clarifies a point that remained somewhat hidden in Augustine's own writing. Having said that, I would like to dwell, if you allow me, on some terminological issues. I do believe that semioticians and historians that deal with the history of philosophy and semiotics should strive somewhat towards a precise and technical meta-language for a host of different reasons. Charles Morris insisted a lot about the need for semiotics to use not only words that are fit for describing the phenomena that we intend to study, but also words that have a high degree of technical precision and that would avoid a certain degree of vagueness. I would say that the distinction between signa naturalia and signa data that resurfaces in your presentation is a case in point. It is definitely a hallmark in the Augustinian semiotics, as you have remarked. As you know, the history of these two terms is also a history of a misnomer, somewhat. This is so because the terms signa naturalia and signa data were somewhat rendered into the English translations, as well as in other languages, Italian, for instance, French as well, as natural science versus conventional science. Whilst the translation of signa naturalia as natural science is accurate, perhaps the translations of signa data as conventional science is less accurate and potentially misleading. This issue was raised in 1962 by a short paper written by Engels, who pointed out that using the terminology conventional science as opposed to natural science would obliterate the rationale of the original distinction and did not do justice to the author's original ethos. Thus, Engels proposed to use given signs or even intentionally given signs in order to stress that this kind of science is not predicated upon, in order to stress that this science is predicated upon whether there is a will and intention from the standpoint of the sign giver to produce the sign and for the sign to occur as well, or whether such intention is lacking. So the title of your presentation, Augustine instituting the given sign, not only references to the primacy of the given signs, but it also makes a reference that these signs are somewhat instituted. Likewise, throughout the paper, you use the terms signa data, given signs, as well as instituted signs interchangeably, thus distinguishing natural signs versus instituted signs. So my question would be the following. I would appreciate if you could clarify for us why the term instituted signs could be perhaps preferable, so a preferable terminology, and whether the original volitional criteria is somewhat preserved if we stick to this somewhat different terminology as compared to the, let's say, original one, or if we compare it to the rendition that was given by Engels. Would you like me to continue with the questions, or shall we proceed like a dialogue?
Well, I'll leave that up to Elma as to whether she'd rather see a dialogue or
Well, I guess a dialogue would be great for both, because to me, this is a very unique kind of distinction between the natural science and conventional science, and it's new to many of us. So I suppose, Dr. Brian, we really are eager to hear your view.
Yeah, so regarding in particular this use of the term instituted, I'm actually using that in the sense, as I mentioned, I'm giving 3 presentations for this open seminar. This first on Augustine, a second on Aquinas, and a third on Ponceau, as well as another commentary on Ponceau. And so the use or the draw of the term institution actually comes from our great organizers of this conference at the University of Coimbra and their heritage in the Conobracenses, who in their discussion, their treatise on signs, refer to, instead of given signs, they refer to signs ex instituto, in contrast to naturalia. And it's, I think it does well capture that intention, that volition, which is perhaps more specific than the more general notion of given. Given, particularly in our culture, maybe not so much in the time of Augustine, but in our culture is, it has a broader significance. So I use the terminology of given as synonymous in some ways with instituted to maybe help situate our thinking about that, at maybe the Conobracenses as a kind of central unifying point, and also a point of departure that Ponceau will pick up himself, and that he doesn't use the terminology of instituted because he looks for a further distinction within signs that are so given or instituted, such that Ponceau will use the terminologies of stipulated and customary. Stipulated or ad placitum, to being placed is the Latin that he uses, right. And ex consuetudine, customary from custom. So the use of the term instituting or instituted signs here is to try and draw a little bit of that historical thread from early Latinity to the end of Latinity. So I don't know if that helps to.
Yes, thank you.
Clarification.
Thank you. Yeah. This brings me to the following up question, still about terminology. You have rightly pointed out that Professor Dilly used instead a different type of terminology to refer to the same division. That is to say, he used physiognomic and teleonomic to refer to signa naturalia and signa data. So I was wondering if you could also elaborate a little further onto this point. I found it very interesting that Dilly used this specific terminology, especially the reference to the physiognomic layer of natural science. So the somewhat reference to the expression of the faces that are somewhat given unintentionally in order to encapsulate the meaning that is assigned to a general class of natural science.
Yeah, and so yeah, you've actually touched here on perhaps one of the issues where John and I had the most frequent and lengthiest disagreements, which is specifically over regards his preference for the term teleonomic in contrast to teleological. And now this is again one of those points where we encounter the historicity of a certain linguistic sign that requires us to, think about, as you so rightly pointed, this sort of necessity of a terminological precision and clarity, as Morris insisted upon drawing, I believe, upon Peirce and his ethics of terminology, his insistence that we have clear and good and precise terms. And so the substitution of nomos for logos in these words. I've perhaps come a little bit closer to John's way of seeing things after a remove a few years and thinking about it more carefully. But I can recall arguments sitting in his office for probably a couple of hours at a time about whether or not we can redeem the word logos to include this signification of thirdness. So I'm definitely expanding beyond the historical here, I think, into more doctrinal issues of semiotics as it's present today. But after all, that's part of what the historical is for. That there's something that we have this difficulty, I suppose we could say, between the logos as pertaining perhaps more to a cognition-independent structural reality, and the nomos to our articulation of structural realities, cognition-dependent and cognition-independent alike. And so this is why I think I've moved a little bit more sympathetic to John's position, that the physiognomic, I think maybe there we could still say physiological, right? But the physiognomic as the structures which belong to things according to their natures as they dispose them. And then the teleonomic, the structures of things insofar as they're ordered towards ends which may or may not be strictly confined to their natures. That is, human beings, we have ends which are not determinate, let's say, entirely by our natures. That we have an active participation in orienting ourselves to our ends, even as much as those might be grounded in and inseparable from our natures. There's an indeterminacy in our participation in attaining them. And so I think that's why, the institution of signs, right, whether they're stipulated or customary or transition from stipulation to custom, that's part of the role that they play, right? Is this self-directedness, self-determination towards the ends which are fitting and appropriate and proper to us, a determination which is not given to us by the physical as such. The physical does not give us all the tools that we need for establishment of those kinds of signs. And so, I think that's what he was getting at anyway.
Thank you.
Book.
It's very fascinating. I think that the papers by Marcus and by Darrell Jackson, which I mentioned in the introduction of my comments, certainly refer to this debate about the terminological issues. And there is a distinction that they made between occurrence of signs and signification of signs. So, and they make this point in order to assess whether in the conventional signs or instituted, as you call them, both occurrence and significance are somewhat decided either by convention, institution, or by nature. So certainly those two earlier articles are somewhat relevant to this discussion. But this also leads me to the next point, which is about the somewhat disregarded issue of natural science in Augustine division, right? So as you pointed out, by tracing the linchpins of Augustine theory of science, natural science are simply mentioned as one head of the division of science without much elaboration. So natural science are somewhat alia quaestio. So natural science fell outside the scope of Augustine's inquiry as his interest was in words, as you pointed out. However, the issue of natural signification resurfaces in the Magistro through the discussion of teaching or demonstrating by way of example. Do you think that in this respect, there is perhaps something that could be still of value, or the thesis of the Solus Magister, the divine illumination, somewhat overshadows Augustine's elaboration on this matter? In other words, whilst learning is not necessarily bounded to outward signs, as it is not necessarily sign-mediated, nonetheless, signs are instrumental to teaching, to showing, to demonstrating, and they can help to attending at least to the search for truth. So is there anything from the discussion of on the teacher that we could perhaps extrapolate and let's say save for our general theory of semiotics that could be of use, or is it altogether somewhat hampered by the conclusion of the Solus Magister, in your view?
I think that certainly there's a great wealth of insights, both with regards to natural signs and to the given signs, the instituted signs. But I think that ultimately, and here I would connect it with that point raised in the De Musica, which one can find in several other passages throughout the De Musica as well, similar points, that even the natural signs are still at this purely instrumental level. And it comes back to that severance of the soul and the body, and the sort of, as it were, absolute superiority of the soul over the body, rather than, say, in contrast to an Aristotelian conception in which anything that's happening to the body is thereby necessarily happening as well to the soul. So the relation, in other words, which is affected, it seems to me, by the sign as something given to sensation or through sensation, doesn't actually reach to the soul. If we can overcome that, if we can get past that, then we can see those contributions that Augustine makes, and I do think save them. But that anthropology, it seems to me, absolutely needs to be revised in order that what's fruitful in the semiotics be elevated and utilized in any further development of our thinking. Right.
This takes me to the last comments, perhaps. Do you think that at this current time, with all the confusion and that is around us, looking inwardly could be something of value or worth pursuing? Or is it something that is completely devoid of value, as it sets on a shaky ground, being based on the divide between the outer world of science and the inner worlds, which, as you pointed out, remain somewhat problematic?
Yeah, well, I think that question can be answered in two ways. I think on the one hand, because there is so much confusion and noise, and the status of the extra-mentally existent signs is one of chaos, that some retreat from those, some turning away from the ubiquity and the preponderance of rapid fire significations certainly would probably give us all a good bit more calm and measure and focus and clarity. But at the same time, I think we need ultimately to develop an ability better to attend to the signs which are in the world around us, so that we might perhaps filter out better the ones that are worth attending to from the ones that are really just noise. And so I think on the one hand, a turn inward, a turn towards a greater reflexivity, not to the inner person as though that is the locus of truth itself, but a reflexivity upon our own concepts in that first sense, which is mentioned by Ponceau in the text that I read out at the end of the lecture, to really thinking about our concepts as themselves signs and how they are orienting us to the world around us, to orienting ourselves to better interpreting the signs of the world around us, I think is absolutely essential and necessary. And I think that even if we don't follow perhaps the letter of Augustine in his proposal to turn to the inward man, I think something of the spirit is something that we should perhaps aspire to.
Absolutely. I have one last comment, which is also a question. I've noticed that throughout the presentation, there is a reference to something which is called the action of science in our field, right? Or also semiosis or semiosis. So considering that perhaps this video or this presentation will be watched by an audience that is perhaps not accustomed to, let's say, the technical jargon that us scholars use, I was wondering whether you could spend some words in explaining what is semiosis from a non-technical perspective, and how is the action of science, let's say, how the action of science could be unpacked for those that don't have our same background. I think our tasks for the future would also be to somewhat discern between a technical terminology for scholars, but also the possibility to access to such a knowledge to an audience that is, again, a non-technical audience, so a layman. So would you like to comment on that, please?
Yeah, this is a topic of recurrent interest for me over the past several months. In fact, I was invited to give a presentation at St. Vincent's College in Latrobe, one of our partners here in organizing this conference, and where Dealey spent his final years of life, oriented towards just that sort of topic. You know, how can we introduce semiotics to the non-technical expert audience? And so I don't think there's any short or perhaps necessarily easy way to do this. The talk I gave ended up being, ended up cutting out a lot of it, and it was still probably too long to hold everyone's attention. But I think if we're to think about the action of signs and to try and present it in as accessible a manner as possible, there are two things that we want to do. The first is to draw upon the obvious examples. There are those examples of things that we call signs: the stop sign, the exit sign, the open sign, sign language, all of these sorts of things which are familiar to us as exhibiting something of that word. But then there's the sign of our own thinking. And I think that's where we really need to perhaps expand upon and draw out the full implication of this notion that signs have a distinctive kind of action to them, that there's a way in which signs operate which is different from the way that things operate. A thing has its action in itself. It is what it is, and it does what it does from within itself, and in regards to other things in the world, it acts upon them, it is acted upon by them. Whereas a sign, the action of a sign, consists precisely in its relating of things. It's not itself a thing which acts, but it is the action of the relation. And so that's obviously a very, sort of abstract and technical point. It's something that I think we could go back to, say, for instance, my example of the door as a sign of privacy. The privacy isn't in the door itself, but we're all familiar with this, right? This is something which surrounds us, something like privacy or anything else that we can refer to in a semiotic sense. It's something which requires a multiplicity. It requires a multiplicity of things in relation. Privacy can't be of one person alone, right? There has to be something in relation to someone else. And so to think about a thing as a sign of privacy is to think about the multiple complex web of relations in which we always actually live, in which we have actual experience. In a way, I'm kind of dodging your question here because I think explaining semiotics in an accessible manner is in a sense the most difficult task of the semiotician.
A challenge for the future.
A challenge for the future. I do intend actually to make that presentation public that I gave at St. Vincent's sometime in the near future. So
excellent.
Maybe that will spark someone else who can give a better, shorter, more succinct explanation of the action of science.
Right.
But thank you.
Thank you. I also understand that there will be some sequel to this lectures in which you will take up one so as a sort of a link to the end of this presentation. So I look forward to listen to that. And thank you once again for bringing forth such an outstanding and brilliant talk to us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your comments. Very helpful, very illuminating, and have given me much more to chew on as we go forward.
Thank you, Dr. Brian. Thank you, Dr. Remo. This is a very engaging dialogue here for us today in this particular session on Augustine instituting the given sign. So gentle reminder to the audience that although we are closing the broadcasting live in Zoom, we are actually continuing here the session for Q&A. So everybody is welcome to participate with comments and questions regarding these two presentations by Dr. Brian and Dr. Remo. Both the speakers are also invited to stay back so that you can engage further with the audience. And at the same time, another gentle reminder that there is another presentation coming up tomorrow, 16 January, and that is on the topic Duns Scotus on Science, Common Nature, High Satiety and Signification by Dr. Paniel Reyes Cardenas. That will be 11 a.m. CST and 5 p.m. UTC. So with this, we close the session for today. Thank you very much, everyone, for participation and for your attention.